He was a decorated Navy SEAL, a man who'd seen war, loss, and silence. And beside him, a German shepherd who'd saved lives in shadows the world would never know. But when the military tried to erase his past, he refused to let them bury the truth. What his loyal dog did that winter morning would expose a lie, redeem a soldier's honor, and remind everyone that faith, like loyalty, never dies in the cold. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Outside the naval compound in Anchorage, Alaska, winter pressed against the glass like a living thing. Snow swept across the parade yard in waves, erasing footprints faster than they could be made. Inside the concrete walls of Conference Room C, the heat struggled against the cold, hissing weakly through the vents. The scent of burnt coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of nervous anticipation. Jack Turner, a man carved from years of discipline and survival, sat rigidly in his chair. At 42, his face carried the story of every deployment, creases etched deep around gray-blue eyes, a faint scar running from temple to jawline, and a beard kept short enough to reveal the square cut of his jaw. His hair, once dark, now carried streaks of iron, and his shoulders, still powerful, shifted with the silent restraint of a soldier who had learned long ago that patience was more dangerous than rage. His dog Ranger, a 7-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat and intelligent amber eyes, lay beside him, head on his paws, watching the room with a predator's quiet alertness. Every twitch of his ear mirrored Jack's control. Across the table sat Colonel Richard Collins, the presiding officer of the Reinstatement Review Board. Collins was a man built on precision and pride. His uniform looked freshly pressed even in this weather, and his posture screamed command. He was in his late 50s, with sharp, angular features that gave him a hawk-like appearance. His hair was silver and perfectly parted, his voice the gravelly echo of decades barking orders. But beneath his veneer of confidence lay the brittle arrogance of a man who had seen glory fade and replaced it with bureaucracy. He had once commanded a destroyer in the Pacific, until a navigation error during a storm cost him a crewman and nearly his reputation. Since then, he'd found comfort in paperwork and procedure. "Mr. Turner," Collins began, his tone measured but heavy with disapproval, "your record indicates an unexplained 5-year gap in active service. Care to explain that to the board?" Jack's gaze remained steady. His hands, clasped in front of him, showed calloused knuckles and faint scars, the souvenirs of a life spent in shadows. "Those years," he said quietly, "were part of an operation that remains classified." "Classified," Collins repeated with thinly veiled mockery, leaning back in his chair. "I've heard that excuse 100 times, usually from men who wish to sound more important than they were." At the far end of the table, Lieutenant Emily Brooks, a young officer serving as the session recorder, lifted her eyes from the file. She couldn't have been more than 30, with auburn hair tucked neatly beneath her cap and a cautious intelligence in her brown eyes. Unlike Collins, her gaze toward Jack held curiosity rather than judgment. Collins continued, flipping through pages as if searching for ammunition. "You claim commendations that can't be verified. You list operations without clear commanding officers. You realize how that looks, don't you, Turner?" Jack's expression didn't change, but the muscle at the corner of his jaw tightened. "I realize how it might look, sir," he replied. "But some things are done for the flag, not the file." Ranger's ears flicked as Collins scoffed audibly. The colonel stood, pacing slowly. "The Navy doesn't work on faith, Mr. Turner. It works on records, proof, accountability. His boots struck the tile with short, deliberate echoes, and I see none of that here. Outside, wind howled against the windows, a distant reminder of the frozen silence that waited beyond. Jack's mind drifted, not to the missions he couldn't speak of, but to the faces of men who hadn't come home. He saw sand turned red under a desert sun, the flicker of tracer fire, the weight of Ranger's body pressed against his leg as they crawled through smoke. He remembered the last order his commanding officer had given before vanishing in Yemen. If they ask, you say nothing. And so he hadn't. Not for 5 years. Not even now. Collins slammed the file shut. "Let me be clear," he said sharply. "You want to return to service, yet you expect us to promote you based on blank pages. You give us nothing but secrecy and scars." Jack exhaled slowly through his nose, the sound barely audible. "With respect, Colonel, not all scars are meant to be explained." Emily shifted uneasily. There was something in Jack's tone, steady, restrained, but carrying the weight of something vast and unspoken. Even Collins hesitated for a heartbeat before recovering his authority. "This board needs transparency," Collins barked, "and you're giving us smoke." He turned to Emily. "Note that Mr. Turner refuses to clarify the period between 2015 and 2020. "Yes, sir," Emily said softly, her pen scratching reluctantly. Ranger lifted his head, sensing Jack's tension. The shepherd's breath fogged faintly in the cold air, his eyes locked on Collins like he was assessing a potential threat. Collins frowned. "You could have left the animal outside?" Jack met his gaze. "He's not an animal, sir. He's my partner." That word hung in the air longer than intended. Collins muttered something under his breath and returned to his chair. "Partnership doesn't mean much in a report, Mr. Turner. Loyalty is admirable but irrelevant." For the first time, Jack's composure wavered, a flicker in his eyes like the crack of ice beneath strain. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "If loyalty's irrelevant, sir, maybe that's why we lose the kind of people we do." Emily froze mid-sentence. Collins's face reddened. "Careful, Turner. You're speaking to a superior officer." Jack said nothing more. The silence that followed was suffocating, filled only by the ticking of the clock and the faint hum of the vents. Then the door opened quietly, and a staff sergeant entered, whispering something into Emily's ear. She looked startled, then handed Collins a sealed envelope stamped "Confidential." Collins tore it open impatiently. Inside was a single sheet with red markings across the top. Letters and codes that Emily didn't recognize, but Jack did. His heart gave one quiet thud, the kind only a soldier hears before a revelation. Collins's brows furrowed as he read. "What is this?" he muttered. Then his face paled slightly. The memo bore the seal of Naval Special Warfare Command, signed by Colonel Marcus Hayes himself. Jack remained silent, eyes steady, as Collins looked up slowly. "We'll reconvene this session once I verify this." Ranger stood, stretching, his claws tapping softly against the floor. The colonel's confidence had faltered. Emily's curiosity had turned into quiet awe. Jack reached down and brushed his hand across the dog's head, murmuring so softly only Ranger could hear. "Easy, boy. Truth's got its own timing." Outside, the storm intensified, wind whistling through the cracks of the old building. The flakes swirled like ghosts over the base where names had been forgotten and missions erased. Inside, beneath the fluorescent light, one man waited, silent, calm, carrying the weight of secrets that no one could see but one loyal dog could sense. And for the first time in years, something in Jack Turner's eyes stirred. A quiet fire, long buried beneath discipline and duty, rising again. Not out of anger, but readiness. The kind of readiness that comes when the past begins to knock. The storm outside had grown louder, wind clawing at the windows as though the world itself wanted in. Inside the cold conference room, time seemed to slow between the hiss of the vents and the rhythmic dripping of melting snow from a soldier's boots left by the door. The walls, lined with portraits of commanders long past, seemed to stare down at the small tribunal with silent judgment. Colonel Richard Collins sat forward, his gray eyes narrowing as he snapped the file shut again, the sound sharp as gunfire. "You think silence is loyalty, Mr. Turner," he said, his voice carrying that particular venom of men who feared what they couldn't control. "But I see cowardice, the kind that hides behind the word classified when the truth is probably far less impressive." Across from him, Jack Turner didn't move. The muscles in his forearm twitched under his rolled-up sleeve, where faded scars crossed veins like old rivers on a map. His gaze remained steady, stone meeting storm. Ranger, the German shepherd at his feet, lifted his head, a low growl curling through his throat, deep and warning. The dog's fur bristled, his ears flat against his head. Every soldier in the room felt the instinctive pull of tension, that primal understanding that danger existed here, not in violence, but in the moment before it. "Control your animal," Collins barked. Jack's voice came out low, even. "He's only reacting to tone, sir." "I'll watch my tone," Collins shot back, rising, "when I get the answers I want." Emily Brooks shifted in her chair. Her face, fair, freckled from northern light, framed by soft auburn hair, was taut with unease. She had joined the Navy to make a difference, not to watch officers crush others beneath protocol. Her pen hovered over the report page but didn't move. "Sir," she began carefully, "there are classified markings in Mr. Turner's file. Some of these correspond to the Naval Special Warfare Command." Collins waved her off with a sharp gesture. "Coincidences, Lieutenant. Every washed-up contractor with delusions of grandeur claims he served in special warfare. Until proven otherwise, Mr. Turner is a man who left the service and wants back in. And if you ask me, that says more about desperation than honor." Emily's throat tightened. She looked at Jack. He hadn't reacted, not visibly. But something in his eyes, gray-blue, cold as the tundra outside, shifted slightly, like a tide receding before a storm surge. "Sir," she tried again, "with respect, I don't think this tone is productive." Collins turned, his glare cutting like frost. "This is my room, Lieutenant, and I'll decide what's productive." Jack finally spoke, his voice quieter than before, but carrying a weight that made even the air pause. "You've made up your mind already, Colonel. I'm just here to let you speak it out loud." That sentence was a spark on dry grass. Collins's hand slammed against the table, rattling the water glasses. "You think this is a joke, Turner? I could have you blacklisted from every military contractor in the country." His breath came heavier, the veins on his neck straining. Jack leaned back slowly. "With respect, sir, I've already been in places where lists don't matter." The silence afterward was electric. The wind outside howled, echoing the rising storm in the room. Emily's eyes darted between them, her pulse quickening. She saw not arrogance in Jack, but the kind of calm that only came from someone who had already lost too much to be intimidated by words. The door creaked open slightly, and Master Sergeant Dean Harlow, one of Collins's aides, peeked in. Harlow was a thick-set man in his mid-40s, with a buzz cut and a permanent scowl that came from too many years enforcing other men's tempers. His voice carried the gravel of cigarettes and resignation. "Sir, we've received a call from—" "Not now," Collins snapped without looking. Harlow hesitated, then stepped inside anyway, holding a folder close to his chest. His hands were rough, scarred from old burns, the kind you didn't get from office work. "It's marked urgent, sir, from command in D.C. Collins yanked it from his grip, muttering as he broke the seal. Harlow's gaze drifted toward Jack, then down to Ranger. There was recognition there, a flicker of respect. He'd served long enough to know the look of real operators. Ranger met his eyes briefly, then went back to resting his muzzle on his paws, though the dog's muscles stayed tense. While Collins skimmed the document, Emily leaned slightly toward Jack, her voice a whisper. "Why don't you just tell him something? Anything?" Jack's jaw tightened. "Because I gave my word to men who didn't come home." That answer struck her harder than she expected. She saw the exhaustion in him now, the kind that lived deeper than bone, the kind that only those who'd carried bodies from battle understood. Collins's chair scraped loudly as he stood again. "This doesn't prove anything," he barked, slapping the document onto the table. "A reference from command doesn't erase 5 missing years." He turned, pacing again. "Do you know how many soldiers hide behind classified to cover up failures, Turner? Men who quit halfway, who couldn't handle the burden, and then wear mystery like a medal?" Ranger's growl deepened. Jack's eyes finally hardened, the calm cracking just enough to reveal the ember beneath. "You're right, sir," he said softly. "Some men do hide behind mystery. Others just carry it because they were ordered to." He rose slowly from his chair. The motion was fluid, deliberate, like a predator coiling before a strike. "I'm not here to defend what's already written in graves." Emily instinctively stepped between them, her voice shaking slightly but firm. "Colonel, please. He's not being insubordinate." Collins's face flushed red. "Lieutenant, you're dismissed from this review if you can't stay objective." Harlow shifted uneasily at the door. "Sir, maybe let's—" "I said dismissed!" Collins roared. The shout echoed against the steel beams, and for a heartbeat, the only sound afterward was the deep, steady rumble of Ranger's chest. Snow pounded harder against the windows, and the lights flickered once. Jack didn't move. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but cut through the air like a blade. "You ever wonder, Colonel, why some of us can't sleep when the wind sounds like gunfire?" Collins froze. It was an old soldier's truth, one that struck somewhere deeper than pride could shield. But instead of reflection, the colonel's defense was anger. "I'm through with this. You'll wait here while I verify this so-called authorization." He grabbed the folder and stormed toward the door, brushing past Harlow so hard the man nearly lost his footing. As the door slammed shut, the tension finally exhaled. Emily turned toward Jack, her face pale. "I'm sorry, Mr. Turner. He's not usually like this." Jack offered a faint, weary smile. "He's exactly like this. Bureaucrats always shout at what they don't understand." He reached down and ran his hand through Ranger's fur. The dog leaned against his leg, calm returning with his touch. Through the frosted window, the storm blurred the world into gray and white. Jack looked toward it, the reflection of snow flickering across his tired face. "The truth doesn't stay buried forever," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "It just waits for the right hands to dig it up." Outside, somewhere beyond the blizzard, a helicopter's faint thrum began to echo in the distance. A sound that would soon bring answers no one in that room was ready for. The sound of the wind outside had turned feral, hurling icy gusts against the metal walls of the base like a creature demanding entry. Inside, the air was tense enough to hum. Lieutenant Emily Brooks sat rigidly, her pen frozen above the page as the muffled beat of rotor blades began to grow louder through the storm. Jack Turner didn't move, though Ranger's ears perked, his body going still in that uncanny alertness only military dogs possess. Then, the door burst open. A rush of cold air swept through, carrying snowflakes that spiraled like white ash before settling on the polished floor. A man stepped through, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy black overcoat dusted with snow. His presence filled the room long before he spoke. Colonel Marcus Hayes, commanding officer of the Naval Special Warfare Command, carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had led men into hell and back. His hair, once dark, was now iron gray and close-cropped, revealing a scar that ran along his temple, a thin, pale line from shrapnel during an operation in Basra years ago. His face was weathered but alert, eyes the deep blue of the Arctic Sea, piercing, analytical, and impossible to lie to. Those who had served under him called him the Sentinel, because he never forgot those who fought beside him, nor forgave those who dishonored them. Every person in the room instinctively rose to attention. Everyone except Jack, who stayed seated for a heartbeat too long. Hayes's gaze landed on him, and a small, knowing smile flickered across his face. "At ease, Chief Turner," he said, his voice rough but steady, a tone that carried memory and command. Jack rose slowly, his posture sharp, controlled. "Sir," he said, voice low, every syllable weighed with years of shared silence. Hayes approached the table, the storm still howling behind him. He reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed folder bound with red tape, marked Declassified by authorization of Naval Special Warfare Command. As he placed it on the table, Colonel Richard Collins, who had just returned, froze mid-step. His face drained of color when he saw the red markings. Hayes nodded toward him without warmth. "Colonel Collins, I assume this is the review of Chief Turner's reinstatement?" Collins cleared his throat, his arrogance fraying under pressure. "Yes, sir. We were just verifying certain inconsistencies." "Verifying?" Hayes's voice cut through the room like a blade. "I received a call 40 minutes ago from the Pentagon informing me one of my men was being interrogated without clearance. Imagine my surprise when I discovered it was Chief Petty Officer Jack Turner, formerly of SEAL Team 6. Emily's eyes widened. Harlow, the Master Sergeant, straightened unconsciously, his instincts recognizing a shift in power. Hayes turned to Jack. "I owe you an apology, Chief. I should have been here sooner." Collins tried to recover. "Sir, I wasn't aware of any record confirming Mr. Turner's continued classified status. His file lacked sufficient—" "Because it was redacted, Colonel," Hayes interrupted, his tone sharp but calm. "By my order. His service wasn't erased. It was protected." He unsealed the folder with a decisive motion and spread its contents across the table. The paper crackled like fire in the silence. Inside lay reports, some partially blacked out, others stamped with mission codes and geographic coordinates. The first page bore the heading, DevGru Unit 12, Operation Shadow Lantern. Hayes tapped the page with one gloved finger. 42 confirmed operations across 3 continents: Afghanistan, Syria, Northern Africa. Chief Turner operated as an embedded tactical specialist under my direct command. Emily leaned closer, her eyes tracing the document's lines. hostage extractions, counter-terror interdictions, high-value target recovery. Her voice faltered. He led these? Led and survived them, Hayes confirmed, which is more than I can say for most. His tone softened slightly as he glanced toward Ranger, who had stood up, tail wagging once before returning to a disciplined stance. And this, Hayes said, crouching slightly, extending a hand toward the dog, must be Ranger. The shepherd tilted his head, then stepped forward, pressing his snout gently against Hayes's hand. Still sharp as ever, Hayes murmured. He saved 2 men in Kandahar when an explosion trapped them under debris. He dragged one by his vest, the other by the arm of his uniform. Collins swallowed hard. The fire of command in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by unease. Sir, none of this was in his record. Because you were never cleared to see it, Hayes said coldly. Chief Turner's missions fell under Tier 1 Joint Operations Command. You have no jurisdiction to question his service record. The colonel's hands clenched behind his back. I meant no disrespect, sir. You were simply out of line. Hayes cut him off. You accused a decorated SEAL of cowardice in front of his peers. You tried to humiliate him for obeying the very oaths that make this uniform worth wearing. The silence that followed was heavy. Emily looked down, ashamed by association, while Harlow shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to fade into the wall. Hayes turned back to Jack. Chief, I read your last report before you left active service. I know what happened in Aleppo. You and Ranger neutralized the target, extracted the hostages, but you lost your second man in the blast. You blamed yourself, even though command cleared you completely. Jack's throat tightened. His eyes, usually cold steel, flickered with something fragile. I should have seen the tripwire, sir. He was right behind me. Hayes shook his head. You saw everything you could. You saved the others. That's why you were awarded the Bronze Star with Valor, which I see you never even claimed. Jack looked away, jaw clenched. Some things don't belong on shelves. The colonel studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. Still the same man I knew. Too much conscience for your own good. Turning back to Collins, Hayes straightened to his full height. Effective immediately, this review is concluded. Chief Turner's record will be reinstated with full honors, and he will receive the appropriate commendations that were withheld due to classification. Furthermore, this board will note that any further inquiries regarding his service are to be directed to my office. Collins nodded stiffly, his face pale. Understood, sir. Hayes placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, the gesture both commanding and human. You've done enough hiding in the shadows, son. Time the Navy remembered your name. Jack gave a small nod, his voice quiet. I never wanted recognition, sir. Just truth. Hayes smiled faintly. Sometimes, Chief, they're the same thing. Ranger gave a single, soft bark, breaking the silence like a punctuation mark. Emily found herself smiling through the tension. For the first time since the meeting began, the room no longer felt cold. Outside, the storm had begun to fade. The snow still fell, but softer now, drifting gently across the runway where the helicopter waited. Hayes turned toward the door, his voice carrying calm authority. Pack your things, Turner. Command wants you back in uniform. Jack looked down at Ranger, who wagged his tail once as if he understood. Then, together, they followed their old commander into the falling snow. Two silhouettes walking back toward the life they had tried so long to leave behind. The blizzard had thickened by the time the review board reconvened. Snowflakes hurled themselves against the reinforced windows of the Anchorage base, their chaotic dance illuminated by the pale flicker of the overhead lights. The air inside felt heavier than before, taut with a quiet shame that even the hum of the heaters couldn't soften. Colonel Richard Collins sat stiffly at the head of the table, his complexion ashen beneath the sterile glow. His hands trembled slightly as he leafed through the open file spread before him. Each page seemed to mock him, filled with words he could barely process: valor, devotion, sacrifice. There, stamped in ink, both official and undeniable, were the honors he had once dismissed as fiction: Bronze Star with valor, 2 Purple Hearts, and a citation describing how Chief Petty Officer Jack Turner shielded his team from a mortar blast during the siege of Kandahar. Across from him, Jack Turner remained motionless, his expression unreadable. His uniform, though simple, bore quiet dignity. The faint sheen of the fabric caught the light with every measured breath he took. His face, framed by short, dark hair and the graying edges of age, showed no triumph, only fatigue. His eyes, cold steel under calm water, stayed fixed on the colonel, not out of anger but something more complex, pity perhaps. Ranger, the German shepherd, sat beside him, posture alert, amber eyes tracking every movement in the room. The faint rise of fur on his neck mirrored his handler's restrained tension. Colonel Marcus Hayes, standing at the side of the table, exuded controlled authority. His uniform was immaculate, his coat draped over one arm, the other hand resting lightly on the back of Jack's chair, a subtle gesture of support. The scar on his temple caught the light when he spoke. "Colonel Collins," he said, his voice firm and low, like distant thunder. "You accused this man, this sailor, of cowardice. Yet the records you now hold prove otherwise. You questioned the silence of a warrior who carried the burden of secrets too classified for even your clearance. You spoke as if honor were something you could measure with paperwork." Collins swallowed, his throat dry. The words struck with surgical precision. "I was unaware, sir," he managed, voice cracking. "The file lacked—" Hayes interrupted, his tone sharpening. "The file lacked your patience, Colonel. That's all." At the far end of the table, Lieutenant Emily Brooks clenched her pen, her knuckles pale against the clipboard. She looked between the men, her eyes glistening not just from relief but from admiration. Her voice came out soft, trembling slightly. "Sir, with respect, he doesn't need to prove anything. Not after this." The sentence hung there, fragile yet immovable, like frost on glass. Hayes nodded faintly. "No, Lieutenant. He doesn't." The colonel's pen slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor. He bent to retrieve it, but the motion seemed to age him. When he rose, his posture no longer carried the sharpness of command. "Chief Turner," Collins began, his tone hoarse, "I owe you an apology I can't rightly put into words." His eyes darted downward, as though afraid to meet the gaze of the man he'd condemned. "I let pride cloud my judgment. I spoke without understanding, and in doing so I disrespected everything you've given for this uniform." Jack's expression softened, though his body remained still. "Sir," he said quietly, "I've been called worse by better men. But I'll accept your apology. Not for me, but for the ones who didn't come back. They deserve better than silence twisted into shame." Hayes turned toward the others seated along the wall, the staff officers, clerks, and junior board members who had watched the spectacle unfold. "Let this be clear," he said. "Every man and woman who serves under the banner of secrecy carries scars unseen. We do not ask for applause. We ask only for understanding. If this institution cannot provide that, then it is not worthy of their service. The words cut through the air like cold wind. Outside, thunder cracked, a rare, haunting sound in a snowstorm, followed by a deep, rolling echo that made the window panes tremble. Ranger barked once, loud and sharp, the sound echoing down the corridor like a declaration. The entire room fell silent again. Emily glanced at the dog and couldn't help but smile faintly. "He's got a sense for timing," she murmured. Jack reached down, resting a gloved hand on Ranger's neck. "He's been my conscience for years," he said softly. Hayes let out a breath that misted faintly in the cold air. "That's more than most men can say for their superiors." His gaze shifted toward Collins, who nodded in silent concession. Then, another figure entered the room. A woman in her 50s, with graying hair tied into a precise bun and the posture of someone who had spent her life commanding silence. Commander Linda Reynolds, the base's legal officer, had arrived to witness the official conclusion of the review. Her voice was clear, crisp, and devoid of ornamentation. "By order of command, this hearing is adjourned. The findings have been reviewed and verified. Chief Petty Officer Jack Turner's service record is reinstated in full with accompanying commendations. Furthermore, disciplinary notes regarding this review will be documented for internal audit." Her eyes, sharp but kind, lingered on Jack a moment longer. "It's good to see that loyalty still means something, Chief, even when it's misunderstood." Jack gave a slight nod. "It's what's left when everything else fades, ma'am." Reynolds offered a rare smile. "Then perhaps that's why it endures." As she turned to leave, Collins stepped forward. His voice, now stripped of rank and bravado, came out raw. "Chief Turner, if you'll allow me, I want to shake your hand." Jack hesitated only a moment before standing. He extended his hand, rough and scarred, into Collins's trembling grasp. The colonel's eyes glistened as their hands met. It was not forgiveness, only acknowledgement. Outside, the snowstorm surged, wind wailing through the hangars and antenna masts, as though nature itself bore witness to the exchange. Inside, the tension began to melt. Emily gathered the papers with quiet reverence, her heart steady for the first time since the hearing began. Hayes looked down at Ranger, who now sat tall beside his handler, tail curled neatly around his paws. "You know," Hayes said, half smiling, "that dog's more soldier than half the men I've commanded." Jack gave a small chuckle. "That's because he doesn't argue with orders. He just understands them." Hayes nodded approvingly, then turned toward the door. "We're not done, Chief. Command wants to see you in Coronado. Seems they've got plans for men like you, and dogs like him." Jack looked at the falling snow outside, its chaotic beauty mirrored in the ghosts that still lingered behind his eyes. "Guess the shadows aren't finished with me yet," he said quietly. Hayes clapped him on the shoulder. "No, Turner, they never are. But maybe this time you'll be walking toward the light." The colonel exited, leaving behind a room that felt lighter, cleansed by humility and frost. Collins sank back into his chair, hands folded, while Emily followed Jack and Ranger to the corridor. The storm had begun to calm, flakes drifting softly now, each one catching the dim gold of the security lights. Ranger trotted ahead, leaving twin prints beside Jack's boots, a man and his dog, bound by the silence only warriors understand. 2 months had passed since the storm that changed everything. Winter still clung to Anchorage, though the sky that morning was a clear, endless blue, stretching above the frozen horizon like glass. The naval base stood silent except for the muffled crunch of boots and the flapping of flags in the wind. Rows of chairs had been set up outside near the memorial courtyard, where the snow was freshly cleared and the sunlight glimmered off the ice like shards of crystal. At the front, a small stage had been erected, draped with the Navy's deep blue banner and the emblem of the Naval Special Warfare Command. The atmosphere was solemn, proud, and heavy with meaning. Jack Turner stood near the edge of the platform, dressed in full uniform for the first time in years. The dark navy fabric hugged his broad shoulders, his medals gleaming faintly against the crisp air. His face bore the quiet gravity of someone who had learned to wear loss like armor. Time had not softened him, but it had deepened his stillness. He ran a hand absently along Ranger's head. The German Shepherd, now 8 years old, looked magnificent. Thick sable coat brushed to a sheen. Intelligent amber eyes scanning the crowd with silent discipline. Around his neck hung a thin silver tag engraved with his name, and beneath it, a freshly polished silver insignia shaped like a trident, a symbol of honor bestowed upon him as a veteran service dog. Colonel Marcus Hayes approached from behind, his footsteps firm, the sound of authority tempered by respect. He wore his full dress whites, his chest a tapestry of ribbons and commendations. His weathered features softened slightly when he looked at Jack. "You look like you never left the field," he said quietly. Jack smiled faintly. "Feels strange being on display instead of in the dirt." Hayes chuckled. "You earned this. Both of you did." As they spoke, officers and guests filled the courtyard. Soldiers, families, journalists, and local officials bundled in coats against the Alaskan chill. The first rows were reserved for senior staff. Lieutenant Emily Brooks sat among them, her auburn hair tucked neatly under her cap, her youthful face bright with pride. Since that day in the review room, she had been reassigned to Hayes's command as his aide. Her meticulousness and moral courage had not gone unnoticed. She caught Jack's eye and smiled, giving a subtle nod of acknowledgement. From the far side of the platform, Colonel Richard Collins approached the podium. His appearance had changed drastically. The once imposing man now carried himself with humility, his back still straight, but his voice quieter, his tone sincere. His face was clean-shaven, revealing lines that seemed deeper than before, carved by guilt and reflection. When he reached the microphone, he paused, scanning the crowd before speaking. "2 months ago," he began, "I sat across from a man whose record I did not understand. I made judgments that dishonored the very code I swore to uphold. Today, I stand here not as his superior, but as a student of his example." A ripple of silence moved through the audience. Collins looked toward Jack, who stood still beside Ranger, hands clasped behind his back. Chief Petty Officer Jack Turner represents what every soldier aspires to be: loyal beyond recognition, humble beyond measure, and brave beyond reason. And his companion Ranger reminds us that courage wears many forms. He paused, the emotion in his voice almost breaking through the formal cadence. In recognition of his service, this base will adopt a new procedural standard, the Turner Protocol, ensuring that no classified operative's record will ever be used against their honor. No one who has bled for this country should ever have to defend their silence again. Applause broke out, restrained at first, then swelling until it echoed across the courtyard. Hayes joined in, his gloved hands clapping once before resting again at his sides. Emily wiped at her eye discreetly. Even Ranger barked once, a sharp, perfect note that drew a few smiles from the crowd. Collins stepped down from the podium and turned to Jack, extending his hand. "I meant what I said," he murmured, his voice low. "I was wrong, and I'll spend the rest of my service making sure others don't repeat it." Jack shook his hand firmly. "Apology accepted, sir," he said simply. Then, after a beat, "We all make choices in the dark. Some of us just carry flashlights later than others." The crowd stirred as Commander Linda Reynolds took the stage next, her posture crisp and her voice clear. The wind tugged at the silver strands of her hair as she read from the citation. "For acts of exceptional valor and leadership under classified conditions, Chief Petty Officer Jack Turner is hereby awarded the Medal of Honor." She turned to Jack. "Step forward, Chief." He obeyed silently, standing before her as Hayes lifted the ribbon from its velvet box. The blue silk shimmered under the light. As Hayes placed it around Jack's neck, a hush fell over the audience. "For bravery seen and unseen," Hayes said softly, his words meant only for him. When the applause returned, it was thunderous. Jack didn't smile. He simply stood there, one hand resting on Ranger's collar, letting the sound wash over him like a distant tide. He turned slightly toward the crowd, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone. "This medal belongs to many," he began. "To the men and women who never made it home. To the ones who served in silence and kept their oaths when it would have been easier to speak. And to those like Ranger here, who remind us that loyalty doesn't need language. It just needs heart." He paused, his gaze distant, perhaps seeing beyond the crowd, beyond the base, to the ghosts that still followed him. "The fight ends for some of us," he continued softly. "But for others, it goes on every day. Remember them." He looked down at Ranger and whispered almost to himself, "We kept our promise, old friend." The dog looked up at him, tail wagging once, as if he understood. The sound of the bass bell rang out across the air, 3 solemn chimes that echoed against the mountains. Snow began to fall again, light and slow, drifting down onto uniforms and shoulders, catching in Ranger's fur. The ceremony ended with salutes all around. Emily approached last, offering Jack a small envelope. "For you," she said shyly. Jack opened it later, after the crowd dispersed. Inside was a photograph, grainy but familiar, a snapshot from Kandahar years ago. A younger Jack, dirt-streaked and smiling faintly, with Ranger beside him, both looking at something off-camera. On the back, Emily had written, "Some stories never needed words. Thank you for living one." That evening, as the sun dipped below the snow-clad peaks, Jack and Ranger stood at the edge of the courtyard, looking out over the icy expanse of Alaska. The flag rippled above them in the twilight wind. The war inside him, after so many years, finally began to quiet. He reached down, resting his hand on Ranger's head once more. "Come on, boy," he said softly. "Time to go home." They walked together into the falling snow, man and dog side by side, leaving behind footprints that the wind would soon erase. But the story of their loyalty, courage, and redemption would remain written forever in the frozen heart of Alaska. Sometimes, God hides his miracles in the quiet places, not in thunder or lightning, but in the steady heartbeat of loyalty, in the courage to keep your word when no one is watching, and in the faith to walk through the storm without knowing where the path will lead. Jack Turner's story reminds us that not all heroes shout their victories. Some simply keep their promises to their brothers, to their country, and to God. And maybe that's the truest kind of miracle, the strength to do what's right even when the world doubts you. In our own lives, we all face storms, moments when silence feels heavy, when our faith is tested, when we wonder if anyone sees the good we do. But remember this: God always sees. He knows every sacrifice made in secret, every tear wiped away unseen. The same grace that carried Jack and his loyal dog through the snow still moves quietly through your life, guiding, protecting, redeeming. So if this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it. Spread the light of faith, courage, and love. Comment below with your thoughts or a prayer for those who still serve in silence. And before you leave, don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hope, miracles, and second chances. May God bless you, watch over your family, and guide every step you take, even through the coldest storms.